Wednesday, Webinar Wednesday, shaping the way we teach English. Webinar course, shaping the way we teach English. Webinar Wednesday.
Welcome to the Shaping the Way We Teach English Webinar Course 15, brought to you by the American English team. My name is Curtis Chan, part of the American English team based in Washington, D.C. Welcome, teachers who are joining us from all over the world. Here you can see the Course 15 schedule. Today is the second webinar course of Course 15. During these webinars, you will hear but not see the presenters. The way for you to participate is by using the chat box, as you are already doing. This is where you can ask questions or make comments related to today's topic. You will also see myself, Moderator Curtis, and also Moderator Heather in the chat box to help you. We also rely on the webinar community to help each other. Your presenter may also ask you questions in the form of polls. These multiple choice questions will appear on the screen for you to answer. Some people may experience technical problems. Unfortunately, we cannot fix individual technical issues, but we will let you know if we are having a global issue. If you do lose sound, a great way to follow along is with the caption pod. Webinar courses consist of 6 webinars. During the course, webinars take place every other Wednesday. Participants who attend at least 4 out of 6 webinars receive an e-certificate from the Regional English Language Officer or local U.S. Embassy. To ensure you are eligible for the e-certificate, we will ask you to submit your attendance at the very end of the webinar. Please do not submit it before we request it, or it won't be counted. For individuals, we just need your email address. For viewing parties, we only need the viewing host email address and the number of participants. Many of you are familiar with our Ning site, but if you haven't registered yet, please do join this site. Here you can find resources and discussion questions related to each webinar. This is also where you can ask presenters questions after the webinar. We also post pre-webinar readings and resources, and we post the recordings and presentations after each webinar. So you can also go back and watch the webinar again or look at the PowerPoint. Raise your hand if you are already a fan of the American English at State on Facebook. We are having a Facebook challenge that we want you to join. Take a picture that shows why English is important to you, tag your photo with hashtag #WeLoveAE on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and also share the AE Facebook page with a friend. And now, welcome to today's webinar, Adapting Materials to Meet Your Classroom Needs, brought to you by the American English team. Have you ever found an activity in a textbook or on the internet that looked interesting but didn't work well when you tried it in the classroom? Many teachers want to use new activities, but due to cultural differences, student level, and their specific context, they often have problems using these materials in their class. Through a variety of examples and communicative activities, you will learn useful techniques on how to successfully adapt materials for your classroom. I'm pleased to welcome our presenters today, Roger Cohen and Russell Barczyk, who are both regional English language officers in Washington, D.C. Before becoming a relo with the U.S. Department of State, Roger Cohen worked at the Defense Language Institute in Texas. He also spent 5 years teaching in Mongolia, where he was an English language fellow. He is the author of the book, Danger in the Desert, True Adventures of a Dinosaur Hunter, and is a graduate of the School of International Training's MA-TESOL program. He and his wife, Tumi, have an 18-month-old daughter, Natalie. Russell Barczyk has been an English language fellow in Northern Morocco and a senior fellow in Beirut, Manamana, and Ankara. He has managed English language programs in Oman, has taught university students in Germany, Mexico, Thailand, and the US, and has worked with teachers in a wide variety of settings. He earned his MA TESOL from Kent State University in 1999. He recently joined the U.S. Department of State and lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife.
Thank you, Curtis. Thanks for the great introduction, Curtis. Hello, everybody. Hi. It's very exciting to be meeting with all of you, talking with all of you this morning. And again, welcome to our webinar, Adapting Materials to Meet Your Classroom Needs. I'm Russell Barczyk.
Hey there, everybody. I'm Roger. And before we jump in, we want to talk just a little bit about those polls that we saw. One comment that really jumped out on me that I saw was that a lot of people said that students expect them to stick to the book when they're teaching, and that might prevent them from adapting materials. That happened to me quite a bit when I was a teacher, and I found that the way I overcame it was as long as I provided a reason for doing other activities and for adapting activities, and as long as I was motivating my students with interesting activities, that question came up much less. So hopefully we'll be able to provide you some reasons and interesting activities so you can hopefully get over that issue in your classroom.
Just a quick comment on the other polls we saw in the lobby. It looks like a big majority of you meeting us today use Ministry of Education textbooks. Next most was commercial textbooks. There's some very good ones of each, and I think both styles of textbook have their advantages and challenges. But we can think about some of the activities we deal with from each of those today. Also, in the second poll question, it looks like, again, almost half of you report that it can be very difficult sometimes to motivate students with only the activities in our book as they're presented. So again, hopefully today we can talk more about that. Of course, motivation is a key issue in our jobs. So let's go ahead and get started talking more about our topic. When we say adapting, what exactly do we mean? So take a look at the cartoon about adapting. The polar bear says, "So we beat the crowd, now what?" And his little friend, the penguin, says, "Adapt, baby, adapt." So they're obviously from a cold climate and not used to the hot weather. So they have to make some changes to fit into their new environment to enjoy their vacation. That happens all the time to us English teachers, that we have to make changes to our materials, textbooks, and lesson plans. Some of these changes we can predict, and some we can't.
And as Russell said, what exactly do we mean by adapting materials? And I'm looking in the chat box here, and a lot of you are coming up with exactly what I'm going to put on the screen right now. For example, one big issue is when we adapt things in our textbooks and materials, A lot of times we need to modify content or tasks for some reason. We need to change it so it suits our own teaching style. Other people I saw already put that when we're adapting, we need to maybe add some material, or sometimes we need to take it out. A lot of you said that sometimes the textbooks move a little too fast for our students. Next, in some cases, the content needs to be reorganized. Sometimes there might be a reading at the beginning of a lesson, and we want to do it at the end. Or we see a grammar point, and perhaps we want to put that later instead of the beginning. Next, something big that comes up quite a bit is addressing omissions. And that means a lot of times for textbooks and materials, they're not always written for us as teachers. They're written by a textbook writer for a general level. And we need to include things that we think are important, maybe some vocabulary, perhaps grammar points that our students really want. And lastly is we need to think about extending tasks, perhaps making them longer, including things that will make them more motivational. Okay, so let's illustrate this point by taking a look at how we'd actually adapt an activity. So here's a sample activity on prepositions of time, and Russell is going to read it over while you take a look.
Okay. So we've got prepositions of time, at, in, and on. At for a specific time, at 7 o'clock. In for longer periods of time, for example, months and years, like in April or in 1974. And on for days and dates. So on Monday or on January 29th. And here's the assignment. Write 2 sentences for each, for at, in, and on. Well, Roger, this example activity seems a little bit boring to me.
Well, it does to me too. Some people might actually like it, but there's a lot we can do to adapt it to make it more motivational and get more out of it for our students. So when we think about adapting an activity like this, we have to think about why are we going to adapt it in the first place. So we talked before about what we do when we adapt, and here let's talk a little bit about why to help frame our conversation for later. So a lot of times, like the activity before, it's not interactive enough. The activity, as we just saw before, it has students complete 2 sentences, but there really isn't any communication between students, so we want to consider this. The second thing about this activity, and for activities in general when we're adapting from textbooks or the internet, is thinking about adding some context. Before, there isn't really any context associated with the activity to really get students to make connections. Thirdly, as we noted before, students need a reason to do activities. A lot of time in class, we as teachers tell our students to do an activity, but we don't really give them a reason to do an activity. So we need to provide them some motivation to do it. And lastly, we need to think about integrating skills. For example, reading, writing, listening, and speaking to help tie in the activity a little bit better.
Roger, those are some serious problems you just mentioned. So how should I go about adapting this activity to make it more interesting and useful for my students?
So that's a good question, Russell. So very quickly, let's go back to that slide and talk about some things pretty quickly about how we can adapt it. So obviously, if an activity is not interactive enough, well, we can provide some communicative activities, and we'll get to those later, and we'll do some with you later. To provide more context, we have to think about making appropriate texts for our students. Thirdly, to provide more motivation, how can we link it better with student interests? And lastly, we have to think about designing different tasks to integrate skills.
Okay, sounds good, Roger. Thank you. So we've talked about why and how to adapt textbooks and materials a little bit. Now let's think of some key considerations for when we do adapt. So I've been really enjoying following the chat box here, and there have already been a lot of good ideas about this. But what do you think are some key considerations you need to think about when adapting textbooks and materials? Okay, the student level.
Yeah, that's a big one. Communicative way, yes, we're going to talk about that later.
Age, yes. Appropriateness. I saw someone earlier mention culture.
Yeah, that's big.
Again.
Just like environment, someone wrote that.
Good. Any others? Wow, you guys type fast.
Student proficiency, kind of like student level.
Good. Well, as we're brainstorming some of these, I'll share with you some of the ideas that Roger and I had. So the first one is class size. So a very practical consideration. We have to think about how many students we have. The next is learner preferences. So different ways students learn. Also, many of you mentioned this one, student level. And then to focus on the students. So teaching learners and not just being confined to the textbook is a consideration. Again, several of you said culture is a big one we need to think about. Here's a comment about from Hazwan and Brunei not being teacher focused but student focused. So yeah, I agree with that in terms of teaching the learners. And also someone else mentioned being communicative. So focusing on that helps as well. Great. So we'll use these main points as the framework for the rest of our webinar today. We'll talk more about each one of these points and see how we can adapt thinking more about them. Okay, so let's take a quick poll and find out if we're going to talk first about class size. Let's see, how big are most of your classes? We certainly had some very big classes in my experience.
Me too. I've taught some classes that are even over 100 students.
Yeah, it certainly becomes difficult with large classes.
Okay, looks like a lot of people teach between 21 to 30 students or 11 to 20.
Up to 40 students still, it's a big class. Okay, it's certainly difficult to think about dealing with large classes. Okay, so let's now think about some of those largest classes and let us know, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges in dealing with your large classes? So it brings all kinds of need for creativity from teachers, concentration, timing.
Concentration, yes.
Space to move around, absolutely.
Yeah, student participation, difficult to control.
Khadija points out there's often mixed ability or multi-level classes, noise.
Yes, Tao from Vietnam said things can get noisy.
Yes, for sure. You need your teacher voice with large classes. Okay, so again, some of the challenges that we talked about between Roger and I were the need to find opportunities to give the students additional student talk time. So it's difficult to let everyone practice in a big class. Also, I think Daniel in Pakistan pointed out, it's difficult to reach each student and give them some attention and feedback from the teacher. Practical concerns that you mentioned when it's noisy, so just hearing and seeing the teacher or the board.
The general environment is tough.
And sharing resources. If you have handouts or textbooks to share, it can be more challenging in a large class. So some of these we can do something about more easily than others, and some we can't help too much. But let's see one example that we definitely can focus on, which is giving students opportunities to talk. So offering more student talk time. So here we're going to listen to a listening activity about introductions from a textbook called American Headway. The directions you'll hear ask students to fill in the blanks with words from the box. So we're not going to do that activity, but instead I'll ask you to vote on a follow-up speaking activity that your students might enjoy based on this listening activity. So the clip is about 1 minute long. Just listen and relax for a minute, and then we'll ask you to vote on one of the follow-up speaking activities. So here we're adapting a listening activity by extending it into another skill. So let's go ahead and listen to the clip, please.
Unit 1, Track 2. Unit 1, Track 2. Read and listen to Maria. Complete the text using the verbs in the box.
Hello, my name's Maria Guzman, and I come from Mexico City. I'm 20, and I'm studying medicine at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. The course lasts 6 years. It's hard work, but I'm enjoying it a lot. I live at home with my mother, father, and grandmother. I can speak 2 foreign languages, English and French. I speak French because my grandmother's from France, and she always spoke to me in French when I was very young. I speak English because I went to an English-speaking high school. After I graduate, I'm going to work for Doctors Without Borders in West Africa because I want to travel and help people.
Okay, so we heard the listening activity. Now think about a speaking activity. So how would you adapt this listening activity to create an extra speaking activity? We've got 3 options there.
Number 1 is certainly in the lead there. Actually, for me, Russell, I've done number 2 a lot, where I have students maybe pretend they're famous people. And I found when students are allowed to pretend they're someone else, it takes a lot of pressure off of them when they're speaking, so they're less afraid to make mistakes.
That's true. In a class, students can pretend to be anyone they want, and they get the same speaking practice. Okay, I guess it's still most practical for students to be able to introduce themselves, so that's probably...
Sure, that's easy to do.
Yeah. Okay, well, these are just some quick ideas. Obviously, there are plenty of others, but it's something to think about when we're extending activities for extra student talk time in a large class. So let's look now at some general recommendations when we're thinking about dealing with large classes. So we can create different listening groups with mixed abilities for the example activity that we saw. Can we go back? We can move the physical classroom arrangement so we can have students from the back come to the front between listening opportunities. We can offer different skills activities as an extension activity. Like I saw someone else mention, we could do writing, we could do speaking, following that activity as a model or input. We could arrange a jigsaw listening activity that we'll see more of next, or an information gap activity that Roger will talk about a bit later. So let's see a quick look at a jigsaw activity. So in case you're not familiar, a jigsaw activity divides up different pieces of the same text. For example, a story to expert groups, like the number groups here, like Team 1, Team 2, and so on. So those members study and understand their piece of the text and then explain it to new group members later to put the whole story together. So that's mixed group A, mixed group B, etc. So it's a very good activity to make sure each student participates and has a chance to play being the teacher. So for the short listening text about Maria, we can imagine each expert group hears a sentence or two about her story, then shares that piece with the next mixed group to put everything together we know about her. For more information, I'd really recommend you visit the website here at jigsaw.org to explain more about that kind of activity. But for now, let's move on to the next consideration we mentioned. So Roger, can you please tell us about learner preferences?
So learner preferences is our next issue when we're thinking about adapting materials and textbooks. I'd like to stop really quickly and just mention one thing. When we talk about adapting textbooks and materials, we're not trying to say our textbook or the materials that we're using are poor in some way. We don't want to sound somehow that using a textbook is negative or insult the authors that they don't know us. However, what we're trying to communicate here is that whatever textbook we use, we want to think of these various considerations to kind of make it our own. And as it said in the video, if you went to the Ning discussion, Mr. Jack Richards talks about teaching from the heart. So when we teach from our heart, we want to think about how we can adapt textbooks and materials for our own classes. So one way that we need to think about when we do this is learner preferences. So what are learner preferences? Obviously, students learn in different ways. Certain activities lend themselves to certain types of learning, certain types of presentation, and a lot of times students enjoy learning in a particular way that helps motivate them. So what are these learner preferences and how can we integrate them when we adapt materials? Well, the first one is visual. So students, a lot of them actually learn well by seeing something. For example, when they're able to see a picture. The second one, auditory. So like me, for example, I'm an auditory learner, so I learn well when I'm able to listen to something, maybe when the teacher does a dictation, or when the teacher gives maybe a short speech. I learn well in this way. The next one with these dancers is kinesthetic. Yes, exactly, Ayesha from Pakistan. These students learn well when they can get up out of their chairs and they can move around the room and do activities that way. The last one, tactile. And by tactile, we mean when students are able to touch things and manipulate things, when they can move things around on their desks. This works very well for tactile learners. I'm kind of curious about my partner here. I'm wondering what type of learner preference he is. or what learner preference he has?
Well, I mean, I'd say it depends, but overall, tactile, I think, Roger.
Okay, that's interesting. So maybe we'll get to that a little bit later. I'd like to do a poll now. I'd like to ask everyone out there, what type of learning do you usually prefer? A lot of people say they're visual learners. Interesting. I didn't know it would be that high. Some people are like Russell, only 4% though. It's interesting that some people put it depends. I said before I'm an auditory learner, but I would also tend to agree with it depends, because a lot of times the learner preference has to be combined with the type of activity we're actually doing. Some activities are obviously geared towards visual learners or auditory learners. Okay. So maybe let's move on and take a look at an actual activity. So here's an actual activity from a textbook. It's from Interchange. Maybe some of you actually use Interchange. So this activity is called word power. So in section A, it asks us to find 2 other words or phrases from the list that usually go with each verb. So the list, we have the bed, a vacation, dancing, the laundry, for some examples. And in the box, we have verbs do, go, have, make, take. And the activity in section A asks the student to make the combinations. We would also call those collocations. And then in section B, it says, circle the things you did last weekend, then compare with a partner. And for example, it might be, I went bowling with my friends and had a good time. So as a teacher myself, this is actually a pretty good activity. But what we want to think about is how we could actually adapt this activity so it works better for our classroom, and perhaps make it work better for certain types of learner preferences. So I'd like to actually turn to my partner here, and I'd like to ask him, he's a tactile learner himself, so if he was going to adapt this activity for a tactile learner, what he would do?
Well, here's an activity I like that's easy to do with vocabulary. So you can put the students in pairs and have them write maybe 4 sentences about their day, something simple, using a collocation in each one of the sentences. So they can cut the sentences up into strips, 1 sentence per strip, and then give them to the next group of students to piece back together, putting together the puzzle of the story. So you've made a tactile activity for everyone in the class with really very little prep time from the teacher.
Yeah, that looks interesting. I've done this one quite a bit. Works very well for tactile learners. It's a lot of fun. So thanks, Russell. Let's take a look at that activity again. So what I'd like to ask everyone is, if you were going to adapt this activity for visual learners, what would you do? How would you adapt this activity for visual learners? Let's take a look at the chat box. Sorry. Have some pictures. Okay, what would we do with pictures? Oh, someone says dramatize. That might be good for kinesthetic learners. Talk about the pictures. Mime and imitate. There's another good kinesthetic activity. Make a diary. That sounds interesting.
So pictures, drawing the pictures and looking at pictures or talking about pictures, it seems to be. Ooh, video, I like that.
That would be fun. Yeah, if you have access to video, that's great. So let's take a look at some quick activities that I've done a lot when I was teaching that suit visual learners pretty well. The first is making partner pictures. And basically, you could have students draw. A lot of people said pictures. So once students complete the activity, what they can do is maybe they can draw an answer, and then they can have their partners guess what the answer is. So can you all guess what the answer to this one is? What is going on in the picture? What am I doing there, Russell?
Well, the people seem to be dancing. There's obviously some music. They look pretty happy. I can guess they're having a party.
Yes, so you can say have a party. It could also be go dancing. That was another choice. I'm not the world's greatest artist, so maybe the next one will improve a bit on that. The next one here is storyboards, and I've used this one quite a bit. It's a really good visual activity because it combines something creative with extended speaking, and it's really easy to do. So students draw their day or a story based on the exercise answers on a piece of paper, and you just have students maybe fold their paper into 4 squares. Then they get together with a partner, show their picture, and use it as a prompt to describe their story using the keywords from the text. So, for example, I could take 4 answers from the exercise and make a little story about my day. For example, I woke up and made my bed. That's one of the answers. Then I went shopping. That's in number 2. In number 3, I did my homework. And in number 4, I could say something like, at night, I went dancing. What do you think of my artistry there, Russell?
You're very talented, Roger.
Thank you.
You have a future as an artist.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, so basically doing your daily routine. The next activity that's very easy to adapt for this type of exercise, and it's becoming very common in textbooks now, it's collocation wheels. So if you remember, one of the verbs in that exercise was make. So rather than students have or just fill out the diagram, we can make it a little bit more visual by having them put make in a circle in the middle of a piece of paper, and they can kind of draw branches connecting to the main circle to show them how these word combinations really connect to the original verb. So there's make a phone call, make dinner, make some photocopies. Maybe they could also put make my bed, and maybe they could keep this in their notebook for later. So let's move on to auditory learners, and Russell will talk a little bit about that.
Some students are more comfortable learning through listening. Here, students can take any of these word combinations, 3 or more, and make up spontaneous short stories, or they could read them to the class as a kind of listening activity for the other students, and the teacher can follow up with, again, spontaneous questions.
Yeah, good stuff, good stuff. Okay, so as Russell said, I'm going to talk a little bit about one of my favorite auditory activities, and again, I'm an auditory learner. And this activity is called a dictoglossus. And dicto, like dictation, and glossus, referring to word or words. And we're actually going to do this activity together, rather than just the both of us talking about it, so you can see what it's really like and how it works. So if you have a piece of paper and a pen nearby, please take a few seconds to get those ready. You're going to need a pen and a piece of paper. Okay, So you're not going to write about this activity in the chat box. You're just going to do it yourself, and actually with a partner, if you're next to a partner, with a piece of paper and a pen. So let's go to the next slide, and I'll go over the instructions about how to do this activity. Okay, so again, this is called a dictoglossus. And first, the objective of this activity is to recreate a listening text as exactly as possible. I said before it's an auditory activity, but obviously there's going to be writing involved. So the first thing you're going to do as a teacher, and I'll do for you, you're going to act like students here, is to pair students. Now you can do this activity by yourself, that's fine in this case. If you're sitting next to someone though, get together with that person and you'll be doing the activity with them, okay? So the third part of the instructions is get your students ready to take notes. So the teacher is going to read a text, and you have to instruct your students to take as many notes as possible. Now, you should tell your students to get comfortable maybe taking notes for just 1 or 2 words for each sentence. You're not going to be able to write notes for the entire text because I'm going to be speaking too quickly for that. The point of this activity is to recreate the text that the teacher says. So you want to take some notes that help jog your memory when you're putting together the text at the end with your partner. So for example, if I said the sentence, "I like ice cream," you wouldn't be able to write down the entire sentence, but you might just take a note in your notebook, for example, ice cream, and later you could try and fill in the blanks. So I'm going to read a text at normal speed, and while I do that, you're going to take notes. And when I finish, Russell is going to read the text again, so then you're going to take more notes, so hopefully you can fill in some of those blanks. When we're done a second time, you're going to compare your notes with the notes of your partner, and you're going to try to put your texts together so there is one final text as closely as possible to what we read. And then we're not going to do it here because of the format of this webinar, but if you're doing this in your class, then you can ask your students to read their texts to each other. And finally, at the end, you show your students the actual text. So before we do this together, you might be wondering what type of text you should use. So that's where adaptation comes in. I'm doing this activity because you can create your own texts really easily from exercise answers. For example, in the exercise we've been working with, I made some simple sentences based on the answers. For example, make the bed, take a vacation, and made up a short text in just a few minutes. So you can do the same thing for your students very easily, and it's a great adaptation for auditory learners. So if you're ready, let's do it. Get your pen and paper ready. And we'll go to the next slide. So remember, please take as many notes as you can while I read it. You won't be able to copy everything, so don't get frustrated. And remember, we're going to read it twice. Ready? Okay, here we go. This morning, after I made my bed, I heard my son make a phone call. He was talking with his friend. I was busy doing the dishes in the kitchen. He then told me he and his friends wanted to take a vacation to New York. I said, no way. At the most, you and your friends can have a party at our house and go bowling. Okay, so now Russell is going to read it a second time. Remember, as Russell reads it, take as many notes as possible.
Okay, ready? So here we go. This morning, after I made my bed, I heard my son make a phone call. He was talking with his friend. I was busy doing the dishes in the kitchen. He then told me that he and his friends wanted to take a vacation to New York. I said, no way. At the most, you and your friends can have a party at our house and go bowling.
Very nice reading, Russell.
Thank you, Roger.
Okay, now that we're done reading the text, usually students would take a few minutes to compare their texts, go over their notes, get together, and fill in the gaps with their partner to make one final text as best as possible. And you then have your students read their texts to the class and compare them with their groups. Due to time, though, we're just going to show you what the actual text looks like, and you can compare. Okay, so this morning after I made my bed, I heard my son make a phone call. He was talking with his friend. I was busy doing the dishes in the kitchen. He then told me he and his friends wanted to take a vacation to New York. I said, no way, at the most, you and your friends can have a party at our house and go bowling. So again, as you see, I took all of those from the exercises. I wrote up a text in just a few minutes, and it was pretty easy to do. So one quick thing some people might be wondering about how you assess an activity like this when you're adapting it for auditory learners. Usually in my case, when I've done this adaptation, my students are so excited doing it that assessment isn't really a big deal. However, some people I know who have done this, maybe they do this adaptation once a week, and every time they do it, they have their students write down maybe how many words they've missed. And if they do it once a week over time, you can kind of see how they improve, and you can talk about listening and note-taking strategies and other ways to help them improve. Okay, so now that we're done with adaptations for auditory learners, let's go to kinesthetic learners. So one thing you can do that people mentioned earlier in the chat box is doing mini dramas. So you might know this as charades. So you can have students act out an answer, and the other students can guess what the answer is. The second one is pairing students. This is great for kinesthetic learners. So for example, from the exercise we've been working from, word power, you give half the class pieces of paper with verbs from the exercise. For example, do, go, have. The other half gets the answers. For example, the bed, the dishes, a lot of fun. Students then have to stand up with their pieces of paper, and then they go find their match in the classroom. Then when they find their match, they sit down with their partner and they complete the exercise. The last one is walk and write, and this gets students out of their chairs. So from that exercise we were looking at, you can maybe write a verb on a piece of paper, and then you tape it to the wall. And then you can have students walk around and write, the various answers like a good time, a trip, shopping, next to the verb, and then possibly have them write sentences on those pieces of paper. So that works really well for kinesthetic learners.
Okay, so thank you, Roger, for that overview and some great ideas of activities we can do to adapt materials for learner preferences. So auditory, visual, kinesthetic, and tactile. Fantastic. The next consideration we want to talk about is student level. So, okay, just a quick show of hands. So just raise your hand if your answer is yes. Do you feel your classes have mixed ability levels? So just raise your hand if so.
Probably a lot.
Yeah, instead of typing in the chat, you can just click the raise your hand button, and I see many people are clicking away there. I suspect most or probably all of us have right now classes with mixed student ability levels. So my next question for you is, what effect does this have?
Good question.
So we've got some students who are very strong, some students who need more time. What effect does this have for you as the teacher?
Good question. Let's see what people have to say in the chat box.
I suspect it makes things a bit tricky for the teacher and how to plan group work. It takes more time to work with the weak ones. Thank you.
Yes, it can slow down lesson time.
Naila from Azerbaijan, very, very true. Some of the strong students dominate. Yes, thank you. So it definitely presents a whole separate set of challenges. So let's see one example of some ways we might handle it. Okay, so we're going to hear just part of a song that if you participated in our webinars before, you probably already know. The song we're going to hear part of is about New Orleans, which is a city in the south of the United States in Louisiana and is very famous for jazz music. So we'll see one common activity that many teachers do with songs, and we'll think about how we can adapt it for classes with mixed ability levels. So let's just see the next clip. So imagine that you have to use this activity, this or something like it is in your book, but you think it's a little too difficult for most of your students. So think about, as you're listening, what could you do to this activity to adapt it to your students' levels, to make it a little bit easier. So you don't have to do the activity now, since we don't have time to fill in the blanks. I just want to show you the type of activity. So don't try to fill in the blanks, but we'll just see the activity, think about what we have to do, and then we'll see some, we'll look for some examples of ways we could make it a bit easier. So let's hear part of this song.
Good morning, New Orleans.
Good morning, New Orleans.
We love you, New Orleans.
We love you, New Orleans.
It's such a lovely thing to love New Orleans. When people come, they never leave because we're swinging that way. The sun shines so, so
The
bright.
sun shines so bright.
The breeze is so, so nice.
The breeze is so nice.
The snowflakes twinkle all night down by the riverside. So by and by, sometimes I cry. It's such a beautiful sight. Some people wonder what all this talk is about. New Orleans. And if you love her, you know what I mean.
Just listen along. Okay, so there's our song. I see we have some suggestions already. Jawan in Korea suggests making fewer blanks. That's a very quick way to fix it a bit. What other ideas? Aha, give them the initial letter. That's a great idea. Thank you, Val. Okay, Thao in Vietnam suggests maybe one student can listen and some of the other students can write.
Marhabo in Uzbekistan says, put it in order. That could be interesting. I think maybe he means some type of jigsaw.
Olesia in Switzerland suggests giving the words, so they could have the words in a box already to choose from.
Play it more than once. Yeah, someone said that. That's a good answer right there.
Excellent. So yeah, some great ideas. I think you already discovered most of the ideas. I had to adapt it. But very quickly, we see we could first play the song in segments, so just pieces. We could let the students work in teams, or we could give some of the letters of the missing words. So all ideas that you already discussed. Excellent. Now let's think of some extending ideas that may be more or less student-centered. Maybe they involve different skills, but if they're a little bit more student-centered, a little less teacher-controlled, it lets the students operate at their own levels. So we'll just very quickly see a few different ideas of what some of those activities could look like. The first one, excuse me, the first one is a speaking activity called Four Corners. So this would probably appeal to a lot of those visual learners, like we talked about before, but also possibly some of the auditory learners. So this activity gets students moving and generates interest in the song. We can hang these pictures showing scenes from New Orleans in different corners of the room and write the title of the song on the board. So we can have students read the song title and choose which picture represents the title or possible themes in the song. Once everyone is in a corner, you can ask students to share with the others in the same corner why they think that picture represents the idea in the song, or what they like or don't like about the picture. So after some small group discussions about each picture in each corner of the room, the groups can then explain to the rest of the class the various reasons why their group feels this way. If you have a note taker, then you're also practicing writing. After they listen to the song, you can allow them to change their opinions, maybe change their corners. There's a lot of variations you can do. So here we have pictures of the French-style architecture in New Orleans, people in costumes from the famous Mardi Gras celebration there, jazz musicians playing in a park, and a steamboat on the Mississippi River, all of which are very typical scenes from New Orleans. If we were to think about developing some writing activities, here's some other ways to let students perform at their own level. For example, if we wanted to follow the song with the writing activity, we could simply cut pieces of the song lyrics and give them to groups of students to arrange like a puzzle as they listen to the song. So if we want to make it a little easier for some groups, we can cut bigger pieces. If we want to make it more challenging for certain groups, we can cut very small pieces. Like the scrambled sentences idea. We could offer a very open-ended activity and ask the students to write a story they can imagine about the life of the singer based on the words that they've understood. Or you could make a little bit more controlled writing activity and ask the class to write the next verse of the song. So in this case, they would have certain limits to what you're asking them to write, but there's still a lot of room for creativity. So if you like this song or these activities, you can find this and more than 20 others like this song on the American English website. So the music you were listening to, if you joined the webinar a little early, You can find those here on American Rhythms. For each song we heard, you can find some lyrics and several activities that are easy to implement in your class. So back to Roger for the next consideration when adapting.
Thanks, Russell. There it is. So as I mentioned before, we have to think about teaching learners, not the textbook or not just the materials that we're using. So, we all know that our class is not the exact same class targeted by the textbook. In fact, the textbook doesn't really target a class at all. A textbook or materials are targeted towards a general level usually. So we always want to ensure we're teaching our learners and not just turning the pages of the textbook. So this requires, some adaptation. For example, let's take a look at another page from a textbook. And this is just an example, so we don't have time to read it. It's a pretty good text, actually. It's about different types of nonverbal communication around the world. The text will likely interest students. As you see, it's divided into several paragraphs there. And at the end, there are questions. And, most reading texts and the way the activities work is students maybe read the text, and then there are comprehension questions or true or false questions that follow. And then maybe the instructor checks them. So, this works from time to time. However, if you do this again and again, it can get a little boring. And sometimes it doesn't necessarily foster interaction between students. So for this section on teaching learners and not the textbook, I'd like to focus on how we can adapt textbook readings and dialogues. And I don't want to go too in-depth about the teaching of reading, but I do want to talk about a couple of strategies to use to adapt textbook readings and dialogues. They're really easy to do. I've used them myself hundreds of times. And you can do these quite a bit when you want to adapt something, and it really brings some spice to your classroom activities. So the first strategy, paraphrasing, I bring up this strategy for adapting reading texts as I've had a great deal of success with it. And, this one never really gets old because it's really student-centered. So first, it's best to use a reading with several paragraphs, just like the one we looked at before. So when you have that, group students by how many paragraphs are in the text. For example, if the text is 4 paragraphs long, then you would put students into groups of 4. Then you assign each paragraph to students in the groups. Then instruct them that they will read the paragraph, so each student has 1 paragraph of the 4 in their group, and they should write down a maximum. There's no exact rule, but say maybe they need to write 10 words that they will use to retell the text. And to back up just a little bit, by paraphrasing, I mean maybe an easier word to use would be retelling. So based on students' notes, they're going to retell the text that they just read. Like when we did the dictaglossus before, that's kind of like a paraphrasing activity when you retell something in your own words. That's what paraphrasing means. So as I was just saying, when you tell students to write down maybe 10 words or 12 words from their paragraph, tell them to write down the most important words, because they're later going to be retelling or paraphrasing their paragraph without help of the textbook. So they're going to be closing the textbook. So after students have taken notes and written down those 10 most important words that can help them retell or paraphrase the paragraph, you have students close their books and you have them retell their paragraphs to the other students in the group. So really they're retelling their paragraph to their fellow students. And what I also have students do is to make sure that students listen to their partners, is I have everyone take notes for the paragraphs that they're listening to. Because when everyone is done paraphrasing their own paragraph, I have them retell the entire text to a partner based on only their notes. So again, it's a pretty simple activity to do. It involves a lot of skills, and you can use it with reading activities that have a few paragraphs. So again, another type of activity that's very common in textbooks are dialogues. So let's take a look at a strategy for adapting dialogues. So here's an example. It's a pretty good dialogue. To start this off, Russell and I are going to read it. And Russell is going to be Rod. Are you ready, Russell?
I'm ready, Roger.
Okay.
Okay.
Hello. Hi, Rod. This is Jenna.
Oh, hi, Jenna. What's up?
I'm going to my best friend's wedding this weekend. I'd love to take some pictures for his website. Would you mind if I borrowed your new digital camera?
No. That's okay, I guess. I don't think I'll need it for anything.
Oh, thanks a million.
Sure. Have you used a digital camera before? It's sort of complicated.
Sure, a couple of times. Would it be okay if I picked it up on Friday night?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay, thanks, Russell.
Yeah.
Very nice reading of Rod there.
Thank you.
So again, dialogues are very common in textbooks. In almost every unit, there's a dialogue. And the way it's usually done in the textbook is students listen, then they do exercises or read the dialogue to each other. Sometimes they might make up their own dialogue using a target structure. And usually these dialogues are presented as a clear model of English. And sometimes students even memorize them. So the question is, why adapt dialogues at all? And how do you adapt them to make them more relevant and helpful for our students? Well, adapting dialogues is a good idea, as teachers often find themselves doing the same activities with them as I just mentioned. So, if you have dialogues, every week after week, it can get a little bit boring. So I'd like to do just a quick adaptation that I've done many times that hopefully you can use in your own classroom that can get students really thinking about the dialogue instead of maybe just reading it and answering questions. So you don't need to answer that question in the chat. That's just kind of a general question. So we're going to move on. I'm going to explain the adaptation to you right now. And by this slide, we want to think of dialogues kind of as proposals instead of models. And by that it means basically how can we work with a dialogue rather than just using the dialogue as the textbook writer says in the textbook, like maybe just reading it and answering questions. We want to think of it as a proposal to use in several different ways. So how would you do this? One way that I use, or I've used quite a bit, is what I call consider questions. And they're basically WH questions that you can make up pretty easily. And they provide a way for you and your students to think about a dialogue, to talk about a dialogue, for students to get involved in a dialogue rather than maybe just reading a dialogue. So if we think about the dialogue that Russell and I just read and have that in mind, and I made up these quick WH questions that I could potentially ask students. And please, you don't need to answer these in the chat room. These are just examples. So if you answer these in the chat room, we would have too many answers. So maybe just take a look at these questions as examples. There's no need to actually answer them yourself. So the first example is, what is Rod and Jenna's relationship? What words or phrases indicate their relationship in the dialogue? How does Rod feel about lending his camera to Jenna? What words or phrases indicate this? What else could Jenna say to make Rod feel more comfortable about lending his camera? So imagine you are Rod. What could you say to refuse Jenna's request in a polite way? So as I was getting at, instead of say just having students read a dialogue and answer questions, if you just think of some WH and imagine questions like number 4, you can adapt a dialogue so your students are thinking about it rather than just reading it. There are a few more ways of adapting dialogues, but because of time, we're going to move on to our next topic, which is adapting for culture. So if you're interested in talking more about dialogues, please join our discussion in the Ning later. And we'll move on to talking about adaptations for culture.
Okay, thanks, Roger. I think those would be fun questions to answer. So next topic, culture. You don't need to answer this question yet. We'll do a quick poll. But another reason many teachers adapt their textbooks, as many of you have already said, is culture. So the poll question, how often do you adapt your textbooks and materials because of cultural reasons? Roger, do you have an opinion here?
I would say almost always, even though, when I was teaching in the United States, even there's regional cultures in the United States, or maybe the culture of the textbook is a little old. So yeah, I would do it frequently myself.
Yeah, okay, that's very true. Even within one country, you have many differences, especially a big one like the US.
Sure.
For myself, I would say maybe like the majority of people responding here, I sometimes adapt my textbooks and materials because of cultural reasons. I think it depends on so many things. That's almost half of us sometimes do. Fair enough. Okay, so since many textbooks are written for students studying in the US or the UK, for example, a lot of the topics, questions, and dialogues don't make as much sense in other countries. So in textbooks, there are often place names that might be unfamiliar to students. For example, when we heard the song earlier about New Orleans, without some explanation before listening to the song, some students might not know where it is or what it's known for. So when introducing new cultural information, which many students can find interesting, be sure it's well explained. So we'll see one example here of an activity prompting us for a role play. This is from a textbook called Classic Classroom Activities. And while it's a great book, most of the activities are set in the US. So here students are given some lines for acting in a role play about some people wanting to rent an apartment. Maybe some of the questions fit where you live, and maybe they don't. We're representing people from all over the world here. So let's see one example more closely. Okay, so we've got a line here in the role play. We've got people looking for an apartment. Sorry, to back up. We have people looking for an apartment and they're asking someone about a new apartment. So some of the questions they might use in the role play, how much is the rent? Is it furnished? Does it allow pets? Does it have air conditioning, a garage, a swimming pool? And if we see one example, a very simple example, the question, does it have air conditioning or a swimming pool? I'll just ask you, for those underlined words, what would people ask about when renting a house or apartment where you live? I suppose you probably need to live somewhere warm to even think about air conditioning.
A balcony. Thanks, Ahmad and Jordan.
Oh, that's a nice idea.
A garden.
Where it rains a lot, you may not have balconies very often.
Yeah, bathroom. That's pretty important.
That would be good. Water, electricity, right. So again, it's a simple example, but one worth thinking about nonetheless. So there's a lot of things we need to consider when looking at culture, but just very quickly, please keep in mind when adapting issues about vocabulary, situations, the characters, and also music, movies, and pictures to make sure all of these are always relevant and interesting to students where you're working. And one last idea I want to share with you about culture are to not just adapt a textbook, but to adapt an idea of creating readings that might be based on cultural content. So here is one example of a storybook that was written by Nepali high school students. So students in Nepal wrote their own stories in English, and another teacher edited the stories and made some discussion questions. So instead of adapting textbooks, in fact, they've simply created them, and these are used by different students among the classes. So this has been done by some professors already, I know, in Nepal, in Russia, and in Turkey. So it's something for you to think about. Okay, and back to Roger for our last topic.
Okay, thanks, Russell. Those are some really great ideas. And this is our last topic. We have just about 5 more minutes, but this one's really important to consider when we're adapting activities. Students aren't communicating. How do we motivate students to communicate? So I'd like to focus on just one concept, and then we'll conclude the webinar. So the concept is called the information gap. And so in its most common form, an information gap is 2 pictures, and you divide students into pairs and you give them a different picture. And then only by asking questions to each other, they have to find the differences in the 2 pictures. And we don't have time to go over all of the differences here. So let's take a look at just what some of the differences are.
I see one in Granny's hairpin.
Yeah, the clocks are different. There, in one picture, there's 2 bananas. In the other picture, there's 3 bananas. So this is a classic information gap activity. So by information gap, we mean there is some difference in information that students have, and only by communicating or talking to each other can they discover the information that the other student has. Now, this is a great activity. However, many of us don't have, many books of 2 nearly identical pictures. So what we're going to talk about is how we can use the concept of an information gap to create students where learners have different information and they have to communicate. So remember, in a lot of activities, we ask students to get in partners or talk to each other, but we don't really give them a reason. We're going to look at a couple of quick ways where we can kind of force, and force in a good way, students to communicate with each other by using the concept of an information gap. Okay, so a couple of activities are, we're going to take a look at gapping exercises and four-window tables. Okay, so here's a very common type of activity. Students need to match the activity, or they need to draw lines together to complete the activity. So how can we make an information gap here and make it more communicative? Well, gap it. So some teachers would make photocopies, but a very easy way to do this is just to divide students into pairs and have one student cover one column and the other student covers the other column. For example, if Russell and I were partners, I would cover the seasons on the left side in my textbook, and he would cover the seasons on the right side in his textbook. So Russell might just say winter, and I would have to listen to Russell and find the answer, and then say something like, in winter, we can make a snowman. Now, I know it's not a huge difference, but rather than just having students fill in letters or draw lines, they're actually communicating with each other. Here's another example of an activity from Interchange, and it asks students to rate activities in order from their most favorite to the least favorite. Again, it's a very good activity, but how can we force students to communicate in an information gap? Well, give them four-window tables. You can ask students to just draw this, and then by finding out the information to complete the table, you're forcing students to communicate. You're creating an information gap where two students do not have the same information, and they have to communicate somehow to complete the activity. So those are some activities that I've used to motivate my students to communicate, and I think they're really easy to do.
Thank you, Roger. Last point here, don't forget, you can always initiate a couple of minutes of natural conversation with your students with their books closed at the beginning or end of your class to get to know them better and to be sure you're all enjoying your time together. You don't always have to adapt your textbook to enjoy your time with your students.
So thank you very much. It's been a real treat for Russell and me. Speaking for Russell, I think if you were to get maybe just one idea out of this webinar that you could use in your own class, we would be very happy. So it's been great fun. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you, and happy adapting.
All right, thank you.